Hello and welcome to this live Nonprofit Pro webinar, top SMS campaigns for nonprofit donor engagement, sponsored by Prompt.io. Hi, I'm Chris Lyons, President and Publisher of Nonprofit Pro and the host of today's event. Before we get started, let me take a second to point out the resources widget at the bottom of your console. It looks like an open book. If you missed the tech tips video we played leading up to the webinar, you can always click this widget for more information on how to use the console and access webinar resources such as the slides from today's webinar. I'm thrilled to welcome today some incredible SMS experts who have joined us. We are welcoming Lindsey Pew, who is the National Senior Director for Relay for Life and the Community Fundraising Operations of American Cancer Society. Debbie Young, Senior Digital Strategist for Newport ONE. Newport ONE is a full-service agency that specializes in serving the nonprofit community. And Farz Sokhansanj, Vice President of Business Development for Prompt.io. Welcome and thanks so much for participating in today's highly relevant and timely webinar. So without further ado, I will kick it over to Farz to start us off. Take it away.
Thank you for that, Chris, and thank you to our hosts, Nonprofit Pro, the panelists, Debbie and Lindsey. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and kick things off with a little bit of a recap of who I am and who Prompt is. So again, I'm Farz Sokhansanj, VP of Business Development at Prompt.io. We are a texting platform with a specific focus on working with nonprofit organizations. We push out a lot of content around thought leadership and been partners with Nonprofit Pro for a while in doing that. I'm going to go into a bit of an agenda planning session for what we're going to be talking about today. There's three main topics that I really want to touch on. The first is the importance of texting for nonprofits. Texting for nonprofits could be a relatively new concept for some folks, and so having a sense of what it means and how it's deployed would be really useful. The second topic will be top SMS donor campaigns. We're very fortunate to have American Cancer Society and Newport ONE here to share in their successes that they've seen in the past and their learnings. And the last section is going to be a little bit of an overview of expert tips and tricks by our panelists. And we're going to segue from that into a Q&A session. So please don't hesitate to drop your questions here in the chat. We'll be getting to them towards the end of the conversation. I'm going to stay on this slide for a moment as we discuss the first topic on the agenda. There are other slides that are going to go into detail, so please do take a look. We'll just stick on this slide for a little bit for the first 5 minutes as we segue into our first topic, the importance of text for nonprofits. So let's go ahead and kick things off. And Debbie, I'm going to position this question for you. The first question I have is, why don't we start with why should nonprofits be texting their donors?
Sure. I think nonprofits should use text as just an additional channel, a way to connect with individuals that want to hear from that nonprofit. We should be using text as we would any other channel. Find the fit between what the donors want to hear about from you and the messages, and using SMS in a way that helps them make that connection. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for why nonprofits should be using text, and we're going to hear different ways. In some cases, it might be event related. Certainly could be things like notifying them about a premium in the mail. It could be, fundraising opportunities. So I think we're going to talk about all the different ways. There's no one fit, really.
Perfect. As a follow-up to that, one other piece of the importance of texting for nonprofits that's worth touching on has to do with the concept of opting in. Lindsey, having worked the campaigns for American Cancer Society that you have, I'm sure that organization has built a substantial opt-in list. I'm curious to know if you have thoughts on the importance of building that opt-in list. And I would also like to remind folks that this does have a bit of a US-centric approach to it. But I'm curious to know what your take on that is, Lindsey.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been trying to do different texting opt-in campaigns for a really long time where, you text this number to this, short code and get people to opt in to text messaging. And we've really not found overwhelming success from it. We've transitioned a lot of our opt-ins to happen through our registration process for our events. So as you're registering an event, for an event, we're asking people to opt into text messages. That's made a really big difference for us. We've also been utilizing the software where we are able to actually text without opting in and, following laws along texting without opt-in. And that's been making a big difference to us as well, because we're able to actually gather those opt-ins just through the initial text message. And it really makes our portfolio of people that we can text out a lot bigger of a bucket. So it's made a big difference to us in the past 2 years that we've been using this.
Debbie, as you advise clients, would you say that including the opt-in component and the cell phone collection component as part of the join registration component of a website has been a predominantly effective method for your clients and you as well?
Yeah, I do. I think of the cell phone numbers and texting opt-in very similar to how we kind of look back on email and email marketing. There's so many parallels there. So there was a point in time when we were talking about how do you opt in emails and how do you get started with something like that. And it's really the same. Adding a phone number and an opt-in on your donate pages is one place to start. If you're just looking for just something to do in some small way. So we're finding that that's a way. Use your website, as Lindsey said, events and other touch points. Really looking at all the different touch points you have with your constituents and seeing where there's an opportunity to collect that phone and to get that opt-in. Very similar to what we have been doing for years now with email.
I really love that framing in particular, Debbie. One thing that I've generally noticed has been trying to position engagement channels based on what the recipient is most reactive to. And so text is a component of an overarching engagement strategy. That's what we typically advise our customers of. It should not be the entire picture. Other engagement channels certainly have a place. And if some engagement channels aren't getting as much back and forth, then that would be a great opportunity and a great list to cultivate for a text-based campaign. So that's a wonderful framing. We can move on over to top SMS donor campaigns. We have a lot to dig into here. And I think I'm going to start with you, Lindsey, and American Cancer Society. Could you outline for us what the top SMS donor campaign has been for American Cancer Society?
Yeah, and I will say that we're really just starting to dip our toes in the water with texting at this level, where we're really using it as our major recruitment strategy for our events. We're piloting it in a number of events in a number of communities, and that's really been our main campaigns that we've been doing. In October, we have our breast cancer walks called Making Strides Against Breast Cancer. And leading up to that, for about 8 weeks leading up to it, we piloted texting for about 8 of our events. And in those events, we did lots of messaging to lapsed participants, inviting them to come back. And then we also did engagement text, asking people who are currently signed up to get involved and be more involved and to fundraise. Our biggest success with that has really been the authenticity from it. We've not utilized a lot of bots or automation. We've really sent out questions, allowed people to respond, and then we engage them in one-on-one responses. And while our staff at times were kind of like, I don't want to be behind my computer, this seems like a waste of time, they were suddenly able to have 200 or 300 personal conversations in a day. And that's really how we've utilized it, a lot more than just, inauthentic one-off messages with just information outreach. We used it more of a opportunity to have that authentic feeling of you're talking to a human being, someone's responding to your questions personally, we're responding back to the questions. And I think that's where we've had a lot of success in really moving the marble on getting our constituents engaged and really ensuring that they're fundraising and have someone to go to and maybe to ask that anonymous question that you're not comfortable asking in a big way, something that might seem silly or stupid to you. Our participants have that outlet to have that person that they're reaching out to.
I really love that. One thing that we've noticed on our end is there's a dramatic difference in types of engagement being made, the type of effectiveness of engagements being had. So, for example, there's a model that I've seen before that I would not advise folks use, which is, I don't know you, I've never talked to you, I'm just going to send you a message once and ask for a donation, versus what you're describing, Lindsey, of that human one-to-one interaction in any situation. And I think this slide actually reflects this as well. Having an ongoing dialogue results in a meaningful interaction that results to, higher affinity for that organization, that program, or that event. In this case, the point I'm looking at specifically is the fact that conversations last on average 4.1 messages, meaning there's a back and forth, there's an ongoing dialogue, which is fantastic, and I think what folks want to see. Can we discuss briefly these two campaigns that were referenced here? Fund the Breakthrough, I think that's bullet point number 3, and the highest performing message, the one below it, Phoenix's Have Any Questions message with a 22% response rate. Lindsey, I'm curious to know, why was Fund the Breakthrough less effective, and why was Have Any Questions in Phoenix so effective?
So Fund the Breakthroughs was a fundraising challenge that we did during the month of October, where we asked all of our Making Strides participants to fundraise acted mission appeals to the American Cancer Society. And so that text message that went out was basically saying, fundraise, do it for our mission, fundraise. And it was that very directive, me telling you to do something. Whereas the next text message that performed much better was when Phoenix said right before their event, do you have any questions? To me, I feel like before we go to a restaurant nowadays, we're going to look at the menu, we're going to read the menu, we're going to know exactly what we're going to order before we get there. And that's kind of the culture of today. So allowing people that outlet to ask those maybe dumb questions, or those questions that they're not that comfortable with, and just asking them, what are the questions before you come into the event? That was us having an authentic conversation with someone versus us just telling someone to do something. And because of that, my favorite story out of the texting campaign was, all of the text messages were from our coordinator there, and her name was Debbie. And when Debbie got to the event, she was the most popular person there. Everyone felt like they'd been having a personal text conversation with their friend Debbie. So they'd see her and say, oh, Debbie, I've been texting you for weeks. And it just gave that authenticity of you're having a real conversation with a human being. And I think that's what people are looking for. No one's looking for those bot responses. People aren't looking for that, inauthentic text message that they're getting from any campaign. They want to feel like they're talking to a friend.
I typically advise people to have clear call to actions, clear CTAs for any message they send out. In hearing you talk about the Phoenix Have a Question message, just clicked in my head that actually is a CTA. The CTA is I want to converse with you, which is fantastic. Debbie, I'm curious what your take is. Do these results surprise you? The fact that the simple Have a Question message resulted in so much more engagement versus what I would have ordinarily said as a clear CTA, which is Fund the Breakthrough message?
No, I don't. It doesn't surprise me because I think everybody's coming at that a little differently. So have any questions? There's probably just so many different responses. So many, everybody has something else in their mind and how they'd like to answer that, right? And the fact that they have a channel to do that is not surprising that so many people took that option.
As it relates to the rest of the bullet points here, unsubscribe rates dropped dramatically after the first message for lapsed participants, implying we can test additional lapsed recruitment messages in the series. So what was was there a number you were looking at, Lindsey, or the team was looking at in terms of, our unsubscribes, it didn't hit this threshold, so this means something. This is a piece of a metric that we should be acting on. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think we're just so scared to get those opt-outs because once you're opted out for text messages, we've lost you. We can't opt you back in through this way. So we're just a little nervous about that. And so this is really our first time that we are trying this in this pilot perspective. So once we did the first big text message where we're sending out 5,000 text messages to lapsed participants or something like that, that's really where you get your first kind of opt-outs. And then after that, when you're continuing to text people, regardless if they responded or not, they kind of are not going to be opting out anymore. So it's allowing us to kind of test different messages after the initial message that we send out, because we're not getting those opt-outs at as higher of a rate. And so we really just thought, let's play around with that messaging after the initial text to see what engages people, what people want to talk about, what actually makes people move the marble to say, I want to sign up, I want to fundraise for you.
That's awesome. Well, I would love to discuss the flip side of this, which is what could have been done differently, which we've mostly touched on to some extent. But I do want to segue briefly over to you, Debbie, in your use case, the example that you have presented here that I'm going to go ahead and click over to, and hear your take on it as you describe what was successful about this campaign, and why do you think it was successful?
Okay. Well, we have one client in particular who's been a little bit ahead of the game in terms of SMS messaging and opt-ins and having a system in place. And their mission is tied strongly to historical content, educational historical content. So, they had got started from delivering educational content, historical content first through this channel. And that was well received. That their audience, their constituents are very thirsty for that kind of content. So, it made sense that was their initiation into using this tool, this channel. And we helped them to align some of that SMS and MMS into their first campaigns and actually using it as a fundraising tool. And so, it was using that opted-in audience. And in some cases, we used the full opt-in file. In other cases, it was targeted subsets of that audience, depending on the message. The example that I have here was using SMS as part of the campaign in conjunction with all these other channels. So there was direct mail, there's email, there were web features like Lightbox and web features promoting this campaign, paid ads. There was a premium, so I think that's important to kind of note too. There was an offer here to get something in association with your donation. And just to kind of put this channel into context of the bigger campaign, it was 2% of the campaign's revenue. So, the SMS messaging from a fundraising standpoint isn't going to make or a campaign. It's not going to, it's going to support it. It's going to give you some dollars you might not necessarily otherwise have. And it certainly could lift response in some of those other channels. And that's really what we saw here. And again, this is an MMS where there was video associated with this message.
One thing to note for folks who are joining now, please do drop questions in the chat. We're curating them and we'll have a Q&A session towards the end of this. As a follow-up, Debbie, to what you just mentioned, so one thing to clarify is the distinction between SMS and MMS. SMS is just the writing text or an emoji, sending an emoji or a URL. That would be considered an SMS. Videos, image files, audio files, things of that nature are what we refer to as MMS messages. In this case, as we're looking at this, it is SMS with MMS. This is clearly a video. So that's what we're referring to between the two. I mentioned earlier, Debbie, that one obvious way that we recommend folks do segmentation of their universe is looking at their total contactable universe and identifying who's not engaging with certain channels, and then leveraging that audience, that cohort, for a text-based campaign. I'm wondering what your take on that is. Is there like an easy, straightforward calculus that your team runs in terms of identifying who should be targeted based on the specific channel?
I think sometimes it has to do with the specific campaign or the specific offer and trying to find that audience that's a good fit for that. So if it's people who have responded to similar campaigns in the past, it's a similar ask, it's a similar offer, then we might pull that segment out and use this channel to communicate with them because we expect that they might have the most interest in that. It might be a good match. So again, it's very similar to email and email marketing. And, kind of going through that same process is who's the right audience, what's the right timing, what else is happening at the time to identify what that segment might be for SMS. So again, I kind of relate it that way to say that the same process you'd be going through with other channels. Could be targeted ads even, that kind of thing, to take you through that process to identify who the right audience is.
There's very, very similar alignment on that front. I came over to this slide to get your sense of, as you're crafting the messages, what your thoughts are in terms of this is more tactical guidance, I would say, but what is the strategy when it comes to messaging text like this?
Well, again, this is in context of these are fundraising messages that we're talking about here. But in the big picture, we do certainly work with our clients to make sure that, as you've alluded to, that we're not using this channel to only fundraise, right? It's not. It's a better fit to warm people up with other types of messages, whether it's event related, news related, content delivery. You don't come out of the gate with fundraising asks through this channel. Otherwise, you're at risk of having them opt out. And then you don't get any of that success with all of that communication. So, that the very first point here is thoughtful warm up to your opt-ins, very judicious messaging frequency and content, making sure you're not coming out of the gate with these kinds of asks. That said, if that's being taken care of and, there's a plan in place for that, then making sure that you have kind of a mix between MMS and SMS, using different media types in your communication, and a balance between the content, like I said, with educational content, informational content, and ask messages. And then this last point here is just showing that, do some testing around your messages, do those A/B tests to see what's going to be most effective.
I love that. We're so used to variant testing, A/B testing in email messaging, and the same can hold true also for texting. Yeah. I've read through both. Go ahead, sorry.
Well, I should say what the results on this one was, because I didn't actually comment on that. But the specific was more effective. Clearly, we raised more money on the specific ask there, not the just general mission ask. So for folks who might be interested to know, yes, more specificity in this case did raise more money. So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how nuanced it is. Instead of saying help preserve battlefields today, it's help preserve Antietam in 3 other battlefields. It's that degree of specificity that actually had dramatic and significant impact in the response types. I'd like to shift back to you, Lindsey, in this slide that we're switching over to right now, which has to do with, what would you do differently, which is kind of the flip side of what we just discussed. I presume that this slide in particular speaks to that. Curious if you could speak to what you intend on doing differently with your texting campaigns going forward.
Yeah, so the one we did for our Making Strides campaigns, we kind of said like, hey, this is what we recommend that you text out, customize it, make it your own, vet it with us. We'll see what you should be sending out. And that, I think we were just creating too much flexibility there for people who are new at texting. They wanted a little bit more guidance. And so that was a really big lesson learned that you'll see kind of up in a lot of the steps for next year, is really we need to give that guidance. Our staff and volunteers aren't super used to sending out text messages, so they need more guidance from us on what are good things to talk about. A lot of times they wanted to get too into the weeds on, specific one-off things, really than looking at a higher level. But again, like I talked about, it's the authenticity piece that we were really shooting for. We're not really doing this on these campaigns from a national perspective. We're doing it from the local event. It's coming from a persona, whether that persona is true or not. It would be some person's name. Maybe it was a real person, or maybe it was the person they represented from the event. But it was, this text message is from Lindsey to Farz. This text message is to you, and it's asking you a question. And so that's really what we were looking at. How can we even make better on that? How can we draw out our timeline on our calendar so that we're looking at text messages maybe more on a 6 or 8 month cycle? So we put in a lot of those text messages that Debbie was talking about that aren't always asks. They're more like thank yous. telling people what we're doing with the money that they're raising, so that we're continuing that conversation throughout the year. Those are really the big things. We really divided up our kind of like texting people from a local event. So we had our admins who would like pull reports and put phone numbers into the system and get all the text ready to go. And then we had a group of people that we called agents, who were the people who were going to be responding to text messages. And so we kind of had different groups of people being engaged in different ways. And we really found a lot of the lessons is we weren't asking our agents enough questions. We weren't asking them, what are people engaging with? What are people liking? What are you hearing from people? And so really just about having more conversations with people who are responding to text to find out, what they were getting out of it, and to keep sharing those stories.
That's fantastic. Debbie, I pose the same question to you in terms of, it sounds like your texting campaign was relatively successful. So maybe you wouldn't do anything differently, but I'm curious if there's anything you would.
I think what we're gonna do is a little bit more in the targeted audience, and like I said, try to be a little more conservative on the entire file that's opted in, and be more selective on what messages each type of person gets, or each segment gets on that. So I think we're going to, try to be a little more strategic in that, so that it's not everyone gets every campaign ask or every message, right? Really trying to split that out and plan it ahead. As Lindsey mentioned, kind of looking ahead in the year to say, okay, in this month, this is how we're going to, send it messages out to these different audiences. So we're going to get a little bit more specific about that now that we've had some of these larger analysis. Well, I shouldn't say larger views of things, so that we can say, yeah, this is, we kind of use the whole list to do some testing, right? And now we've gotten some results back from that we can do some of these smaller groups. So where if we do some tests in the smaller groups, we might not have the results in those small sends.
Absolutely. I could stay on this topic for quite a bit, but being mindful of time and knowing we have a third topic to get to, which we are essentially touching on right now, I'm going to go into a lot more detail on that. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to topic number 3, expert tips and tricks to get the most out of your texting program. So I'll start with saying that one thing, Lindsey, you had added to your slide that we were just on had to do with list segmentation. One thing being on the vendor side of things that I hear a lot is, what's a standard open rate? How many people are going to actually open my message and engage with it and do something with it? And there's never a good answer to that question, because it all comes down to, what was your message, who was your list, and how did you segment it? And so I love that you added that to your slide, because there is very little limitation on how detailed you could be with segmentation. And Debbie, you just touched on that exact same topic yourself. So it's a fantastic flag for us to segue into the expert tips and tricks component of this session. Why don't I start with something as basic, not as basic really, more top level, as how to even start developing a good SMS strategy. Like, tactically, what are the processes, what are the steps that y'all undertook specifically that the rest can learn from? Lindsey, why don't I start with you?
The first thing that we did was we hired a text consultant. That's obviously been a game changer for us. All of us thought we had a little bit of expertise in a lot of things, but we really didn't have that expertise on what our actual texting strategy should be. I will say, I think we're still playing around with it. The first text we got, first time we sent a text, we were so excited. We sent 40,000 texts out in one day, and it was kind of a big fail. And then we talked to a lot of people that day, and it was very intense. But we realized that really wasn't our sweet spot. So it's taken us about a year in trying to figure out different pilots and different opportunities. All of ours is really related to our events and our fundraising events at the moment. So our biggest focus is really the recruitment of people. And that's really where we found our sweet spot. So again, it's taken us about a year to get there, but our biggest first step we took was hiring a consultant to help us, because a lot of times what we thought were great first text messages, our consultant was immediately like, what if you phrased it like this? And we were like, oh, duh, of course, that's amazing. So it really just helped us think about things in a lot of different ways and really build out our strategy and what that would look like. It's also helped us look at our numbers a lot. because we're not really able to track exactly who registered based on the text messages, we've not really been able to figure that out yet based on how our lists work. It's really helped us figuring out our numbers of the metrics that we can see based on who's responding, how they're responding, what our time frames in, what our response times in, what text messages are working well. It's really helped us look at those numbers, analyze them, and help us look at success from different lenses.
Debbie, you are on the consulting front at Newport ONE, right? So you would be the person that someone like Lindsey would talk to start formulating a strategy. So I'm curious to hear what your take is on that.
Yeah, well, we have a lot of clients right now who are at this very early stage of things, as you can imagine. And, you know, we're trying to work with them where they're at, what tools they currently have. So and every organization is a little different. We look at what staff they have. You know, if they have in-house staff that's really good at email, okay, that's a resource that maybe could carry over to SMS in managing that. Look at what platforms they have. Do they have something already in place and they're just not using it? Do they need to start with getting some kind of texting platform in place? Do they have any phone cell numbers opted in, or are we starting from scratch to see if we need to get started there? And even just helping them with how do they collect it? What language do they use? Do they need to update their privacy policy, to account for this new data, that kind of thing. So we kind of walk through some of that initially before we even start talking about the messages themselves, because there are going to be messages that, we can get to that point. We can put together a calendar for what kind of messages to send out, what kind of schedule to put together, what kind of frequency, but getting some of that infrastructure in place first, business rules, is kind of where we start. And everybody's at that point, but we try to work with what they already have first to see what that might be. They may have more than what they realize. I do have some clients who didn't know that they even have some SMS functionality in the database or in the tool that they already have for, let's say, email or what have you. So I'm just trying to look at that. And if they have nothing, then talking, with platforms to get that started as well.
I've noticed, being on the platform side, on the vendor side of things, I've noticed that institutional organizational buy-in tends to be one of the first major hurdles to deal with. And so tactically getting over that hump to segue into now, what do we do in terms of the specific vendors we're going to be using and putting together a message? The long story short of that sounds like it's a process, and there is no, we're just going to get up and running ASAP situation. It requires the same thought that, getting an email campaign up and running as well. So it looks like we're getting a lot of really, really great questions. I'm going to segue over to the Q&A side of things, because there's quite a bit to get through here. So I'm wondering, for the panelists, Debbie, Lindsey, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on under experts, tips, and tricks, the top donor campaigns that you run, or the importance of text for nonprofit, before we segue over into the Q&A session?
I'll just say one other comment there, Farz. I think a lot of times with new things like paid ads, or like I said, when we started email, paid ads, now here SMS, I think sometimes nonprofits think it all has to be perfectly orchestrated in order to get started. And everything, all the answers have to be there, and it has to be, this big strategic thing. But I think sometimes you just have to start small and start with something. Start with a small file, start with a, select message, and kind of get started with it. That's where I've seen, it just takes a little bit. So start small, I think, is the recommendation I would have there.
I can't agree with that more. I think in American Cancer Society, there was basically two of us, and we kind of begged for this, and we were kind of told, okay, kind of go for it if you want to, and you feel like it's okay thing to do. And it's taken us a couple years. From the two of us now, we probably have 45 people who are doing it, and we've been able to expand it out. But it's the same thing, like you were saying, start small, and you'll get there eventually.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And I'll go ahead and start reading off Q&As. Again, anybody who joined, please feel free to drop the Q&As. The team on the back end is curating them and dropping them somewhere for me to react to. So don't hesitate to drop your questions there. So I'll go ahead and start things off. When it comes to a message that I saw come in a little bit earlier that really touches on that strategy component, which is what is a good frequency for messages? Just chiming in on my perspective, it is so case dependent, but I'll segue it over to our experts in terms of what their take is. The question is, what is a good frequency for messaging? Debbie, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I did see that came up a number of times in the question, so I wasn't surprised when you picked that one. So I think, again, I keep using the word judicious, and we're kind of guiding our clients towards the 1 to 2 per month, and to put that frequency in your opt-in, to let folks know in that opt-in process what to expect, set expectations that it is going to be low in numbers. It's not going to be similar to maybe what they do with other channels or email, for example. So, I would say, out of context of any, in general, events are a little bit more unique, where it's, you have things building up to a certain event, and you might need to increase that frequency around that. But, in general, for an organization to make that commitment that it's 1 to 2 times a month.
Lindsey, same to you. So much of what you do is around events, and given what Debbie just mentioned, I'm wondering, is that accurate? It's mostly just a ramp up to the event time? I think we might have lost Debbie. Sorry, not Debbie, Lindsey.
I'm back, sorry.
All good. Yeah, so what I was asking was, so much of what you do is around events, and so I'm wondering if, for the frequency of messages going out, is it essentially just a steady ramp up to the event, so there is no one size fits all for frequency?
Well, I think getting back to that authenticity piece is where we try to live. And, if you were going to go, if you had a party, we kind of think about that, and personally what I would do with my friends. I might let them know a couple months beforehand to save the date. Leading up to it, I text them a little bit more. What are you bringing? Where are you going to park? Who's going to be coming? That sort of thing. So we kind of build it and ramp it up like that. But then, just like your friends, you don't never text them again after the party's over. So we also want to continue that engagement and that conversation and building that relationship. We're really trying to utilize text messaging not as a communication out, but an opportunity to build a relationship. So that's kind of how we're thinking on it. It definitely does ramp up closer to our events, but then, we want to have a steady pace afterwards.
And Lindsey, I'll ask this one as well. I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier when I mentioned the organizational opt-in component, and I know you have experience with this, so I'm posing this to you. The question is, especially in the nonprofit sector where money is always tight, what advice do you have for pitching an SMS campaign and an SMS program, quote, yet another marketing expense to your team?
Yeah, like Debbie said, I would definitely recommend starting small. When we started small, the monthly cost wasn't so high that it didn't make sense. We thought that the monthly cost made a lot of sense. I think at this point, too, in the nonprofit world, working through our consultant, we were able to get lots of competitive analysis, looking what other nonprofits are doing and what success they saw. It really helped us bring home the ROI that we thought we'd see with it. And it's just something that we have to constantly evaluate. I don't think that we're there. I'm not pleased with where we are with American Cancer Society's, wanting to take this on as a whole. I think we need a team of lots of people to manage this, and I think that we need to expand this to everything that we do within American Cancer Society. But we started small. We started with, our endurance program that has the smallest number of events that we have, and really a finite group of people. Then we kind of expanded it to our Relay for Life program and our Making Strides program, and they're expanding it out event by event as we go. And I think that's really the key to our success, is proving it along the way, starting small so that you can really see that ROI.
Debbie, is there anything you'd like to add to that opt-in, or not the buy-in component to that?
I guess I would say if you had success with making the case for paid advertising, digital advertising, it's going to be similar to that. So it's that same, again, if you've had success making that case, then you kind of can duplicate that effort. And similarly, if you haven't had that success, then you really have to kind of start from scratch in terms of making the case for it. But I would look at that, because a lot of times, a lot of organizations are already doing paid advertising. So, I would look at what it took to get funding for that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would say, just to chime in on that, on Prompt.io's end, we definitely encourage a crawl, walk, run approach to getting going. We don't want anybody to overcommit to anything. We want the strategy to be there, the ideas on what to do to be there, and then we work our contracting out from that point forward. I will say there's so many great questions coming in that I think we're going to take this all the way to the top of the hour. One question that came in that I really like, that touches on something, Debbie, that you brought up, so I'd love to get your feedback on this, is one of the challenges with SMS is the constraints on the size of the message. How do you overcome that?
Oh, we get very crafty with limiting our words. That's what you mean. Yeah, we try not to say, again, the example that I gave, certainly the organization's name was very long. And we do think that that's important to have that in there, if at all possible. So, yeah, I think, you just have to, a lot of times we're just using the tool and keep retooling it different ways to try to minimize the words and get the same effect for that. So, and then to save your larger messages for kind of the blockbusters, let's say, right? So we're not going to use MMS for, we're going to use MMS for the big campaigns and the ones that have the most potential to raise money, that kind of thing. So I guess that's the best way I can answer it for now.
I would say that you become really proficient at chopping out words that don't add to the message. The MMS component is really interesting. Seeing from our side, the vendor side of things, it is becoming a really effective way to get through the clutter. Somebody else asked a question around being inundated with messages, whether that has an impact on the efficacy of texting. One thing that we're noticing and that gets around the character count limitations of an SMS is sending an MMS, a multimedia message. So that's another way to do it. Another question came in for Giving Tuesday, which is obviously an incredibly important day for nonprofits. The question was, for something like Giving Tuesday, can you text multiple times in one day? Lindsey, Debbie, I guess, Lindsey, I'll ask you first. Y'all don't do text-based fundraising for Giving Tuesday yet, do you?
Not at that scale. I mean, we definitely do, like, for our events. I mean, if we have events that are, kind of opted into this fundraising, we'll probably send them a text message. But I wouldn't say that from our campaign perspective, that's not something we do. But I would definitely say, if they're engaged, I mean, I think it's a great tactic to look at people who are responding to your text message and segment your audience based on how people are engaging with you. If they're engaging with you, I'd say there's nothing wrong with texting them more and being more frequent, having more frequent conversations with them, even if it's on the same day, because they've already kind of told you that they're engaged with you through their conversation. So we utilize a lot of tagging when we send our text message out to help us understand people's engagement with us so that we can segment our audiences and engage with them differently. So that's kind of how I would respond to anything that you're looking at, texting people at a more frequent rate than others.
One strategy that I've seen used effectively for this has been when there's a target set and the target has been communicated with the donor base, giving updates to the donor base of where things stand with that target has been an effective justification for repeat messaging on a single day for fundraising purposes. And it's a really useful and effective way to get a network effect going of other people who are within that donor's network to also donate and join the organization. But Debbie, I'll pose the question to you as well regarding Giving Tuesday. As more generally, is there a specific texting strategy you deploy for that day?
I don't know that I would go, I don't know that I would start again, it depends on kind of where the organization is at. If they haven't done a lot of fundraising messaging in the past, then I wouldn't necessarily hit your first Giving Tuesday with multiple messages in the day. I might start with, okay, let's send out one and go from there and see how that's received. Again, the last thing we want to do is have people opting out, because it was too many in that day. So, I think I would probably be a little more careful about Giving Tuesday. There's a lot of messaging coming in, and I would use SMS for your, let's say, your most loyal recipients, and start there with a message, and then kind of see what response you get first.
Great. We have a question regarding platforms. The question is, what texting platform would you recommend? Finding a good one is overwhelming. So obviously Prompt works with American Cancer, and Newport has you have your own selection methods there. I'm curious, I'll start with you, Lindsey, in terms of what the process was like for you and what guidance you can offer to others.
We did a lot of research on and really from our vendors, from vendors that we looked at. There was a lot of vendors that did a lot of, that might be at a higher price point, that did a lot more of the sending the text message for you, responding to the text message for you. And we thought, hey, we have staff and volunteers who can do that. We can opt out of that. And then we looked at integration within our CRM system. What companies might integrate with our CRM system? What company might work the best for that? What companies offer, and Farz, you might have to help me on the phrasing here, but not just peer-to-peer text message, but text message that we can send out without the opt-in. So there are different functionalities that we were looking for, as well as different, just integrations we needed, and just what we were looking for as a company. So I think it was really about us identifying what we thought we kind of really wanted and looking for vendors that offered that for us.
Sorry, my mute button was hidden there for a second. Thank you for that, Lindsey. One thing, I can actually really empathize with this question. I attend a lot of conferences in the space, and every vendor is the fastest, the best, the easiest to use, the cheapest. so it can be a little bit overwhelming looking at just the marketing content. So I'll pose the same question to you, Debbie.
Yeah, I think Lindsey hit it. I mean, it does depend on, I think integration is a big factor. So you kind of have to look at what platforms you already have. What's your donor database? What's your digital software? What are you using for donate pages? What's there already, and what integrates? If there's something that integrates, great. Let's start with that. And as an agency, we're neutral on all of those platforms. We're going to ride along and do the demos with you and ask the questions and make sure that it's a good fit, that kind of thing. And every organization's really different when it comes to that. Again, workflow has to be a part of the equation, and current platforms have to be a part of that equation. So that's how we approach it. Is really it's not going to be the same answer for each nonprofit.
Yeah, I love that you hit on integration specifically. Having an end-to-end view to be able to effectively understand who that supporter, donor, what have you, event RSVP is critically important. So that's a piece of that for sure. There's a question here around baby boomers that I'd love to address as well, the panel to address as well, which is how receptive is the baby boomer generation to SMS fundraising on the whole? I want to go to you, Debbie, because the example you gave us had to do with saving battlefields, and it just feels it feels like this would be very much up your alley.
That's right. It doesn't get much more baby boomer than that audience. So I think that just the fact that we have had success with that client and that audience answers that question for you. It's older men is really a lot of that audience. So not the typical, again, female fundraiser for some of our other clients. We have an older audience opting into SMS and responding. So it certainly is not maybe not what you would guess out of the box there, but yeah, it does work. So don't exclude it.
I would totally understand if you don't have an answer to this, but I'm actually very curious around whether there's been any any analytics done in terms of that demographics receptiveness on text versus email. Because I know that email is very much a traditionally known way to engage and fundraise, and specifically baby boomers. But I'm wondering, hey, what are your thoughts on that, Debbie? Is there a distinction, or is it same as everything else we've been talking about, which is select the cohort and engage accordingly?
Yeah, I think so. And we don't encourage you to necessarily exclude any individuals from certain channels, right? Because the same donor may respond to that Facebook ad tomorrow instead of the SMS or the email. So, our recommendation is going to continue to be to look at multiple channels and to work multiple channels for any given campaign. So I don't think that there's been, I don't know any studies that's going to answer that to say, yeah, focus this audience on this channel specifically.
One question. Sorry?
Oh, I said, I think it's too new to be able to come to those kinds of broad conclusions.
Totally. One question that we received that gets into the tactical a little bit that I really, really love says, should you say it's you every time you text? I work at the San Antonio Botanical Garden and we only use SABOT internally. Do I have to say it's the garden or mention the Botanical Garden every time? Let me give you my perspective and I'll hand it off to the panelists. In theory, that number that you're the number that you're sending the outbound message from is one that initially introduced who you are. And in theory, hopefully that individual saved it. If not, you could send them a V card to do that. But for the sake of saving space on your SMS messages, I probably wouldn't include that every single time. I would, if a long enough time has lapsed between the last engagement with that individual, maybe it's worth bringing up. But I'm curious to hear, Lindsey, do you know what the practices are over on American Cancer's end?
Yeah, we think it's really important to create a persona that you're texting from. So it's never from American Cancer Society Relay for Life. It's from Lindsey at Relay for Life, or Lindsey at American Cancer Society, or Lindsey at Making Strides Walk, or however we want to phrase that. And, we want to make it feel authentic. So at times we've often texted people too and said, make sure to save this phone number because you'll be receiving more texts from me, so that we don't have to redo that introduction. But I think it's very important. The first text message you send is your introduction. And then, you don't have to introduce yourself again if you're sending regular text messages. If it's been more than 6 months, more than a year, you probably need to reintroduce yourself again.
There's a question here, I think, directed at you, Lindsey, which is, how many people did you have to assign to respond to messages?
It really depended how many text messages that we were sending out. We want to be able to, if you reply back to us, we want to be able to respond within an hour or so. And so, if we had about 3,000 text messages go out, we might kind of tier them to go out at different segments throughout the day. So we do 300 at a time, or maybe 500 at a time, or something like that. So we had time to respond to text messages quickly. We would train 3 to 4 people per event. We probably usually only had 1 or 2 people responding to text messages at a time. As long as you don't do too many at once, it was pretty easy to handle. I also did see a conversation a question come in about how do we balance that with balancing people who need to be out in the community and fundraising and putting on the logistics of the event and planning an event. And that was a really hard thing we had to tackle with training our staff, that this is as good as a day in the field of what we would have normally said. When you have to go out into that community and your job is to find new people, find a sponsor, get teams to fundraise, plan logistics and things like that. This is as successful because very rarely do you have a day where you're able to have a personal conversation with 200 or 300 people in one day.
That's awesome. And Debbie, I would assume that this question probably comes up quite a bit as you're doing kind of a strategy session. How much staff is available? How are resources allocated? Here's where your thoughts are in terms of organizations being able to answer this question for themselves.
Yeah, we tend to do the lifting of the creative. So, we take that as an agency, we kind of manage that, but clearly someone has to own that platform, right? The tool itself. And so, we look at who's already managing the CRM or has some of that skill set to be able to do that and keep on top of that and work through the setup and the configuration of that. So, again, we're trying to align the right resources internally that you already have. And it's, as I said, we're not sending that many messages. We're not recommending sending that many messages. So, we're trying to manage, make it manageable. Let's just say that.
Awesome. I'll read one more question. We have 5 minutes to go. There's so many more questions here that I wish we had more time. And this has been fantastic. But I'm going to read one more, and then we'll, if there's any follow-up questions that folks want to ask any of us directly, please feel free to reach out to us. The question I have here, very pertinent, is as SMS outreach becomes more and more popular for every type of business and organization, I find that my phone becomes inundated with text advertisements and alerts, especially around holidays and calendar milestones. What advice do you have to rise above the clutter and avoid getting opted out en masse with the other advertisers? Debbie, I'll ask you that question.
As much as possible, if you can have some kind of an offer, something to offer for staying on, right? Is there a discount? Is there a coupon? Do you have a corporate sponsor who will help, give something away? Make it as enticing as possible to thank people for being opting in and staying opted in. And if you have something to offer, think about doing that.
Lindsey, I would assume that with American Cancer, given that it's event, a lot of this has to do with event-based, it's mostly just cultivating the relationship so it's not a random message, like every other message they get. Was that a fair assessment?
Yeah, you've probably heard me say it 10 times during this hour, is authenticity is where we try to see our value, is building a relationship through authenticity. I mean, we even tell people don't text people during the event, because if I'm used to getting a text message from Debbie and she's standing right in front of me and I get a text message, that's not authentic. We want it to be authentic engagement and relationship building. So we really just try to make it seem like this is an individual text message from a person.
Awesome. I think with that, we'll go ahead and close it out. I want to thank the folks over at Nonprofit Pro for hosting this, Chris, Cherie, and our panelists here, Debbie and Lindsey. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your wisdom.
Terrific, Farz. Thank you so much. I found this to be a truly fascinating webinar. Well done. And for all of our Nonprofit Pro webinar members, please come to our Nonprofit Pro webinars site for all the other ones that we've run in the past, and keep your eyes open for future ones that we have coming up. In addition to that, please take a moment to fill out the feedback survey at the end of this webinar. And for those folks that did submit questions, we will supply them to the prompt team and the speakers where appropriate, and we will get back to you with answers to all of those questions. So one last time, Debbie, Lindsey, and Farz, thank you all so much for a terrific session on SMS communications.